Welcome back, everybody. Why Mix What I Like. Again, I'm Jared Ball. Happy to be your host. Thanks again to the patrons and channel members who are getting this first, if not exclusively, because this is an extension of the conversation that I wanted to start in this space around what we do and don't understand about Jews, their relationship to the world, to geopolitical, economic relationships and situations, and then, of course, how that community does or does not relate and or compare to the experience of Black people here in the U.S. in particular. Just wanted to follow up on something because I have not forgotten about this. This is something that is still obviously comes up all the time and is still, I think, widely misunderstood. And again, this is an extension of the previous video I did starting this discussion around we have no analysis of Jews. And in response to that video, at least one of you made reference to Israel Shahak, who I haven't read in 25, 30 years, and wanted to revisit given his perspective as an Israeli Jew and at minimum a critic of Zionism, if not fully against it. And I found this interview that he did about a book that he wrote some years ago, which I've ordered and is on its way. But I thought a couple things that he says in here are really interesting and relevant to the discussion that I've been having. So if you haven't, please go back and check out that other video. We have no analysis of Jews, so I don't have to repeat any of the full context of this. And then we can just sort of get into the video. So let's go. Thanks again to the patrons and channel members.
The classical period is formation of the Jewish or Israelite nation in Palestine, let's say from the period of the Judges and then the three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. Let us say from the 11th century BC. It ends more or less with the Babylonian exile at 587 BC. Then a minority of Jews only return to Palestine and continue in completely another way the ordering of their society. Then there is a dispersal of Jews in about final dispersal, 4th, 5th century AD. From that time, the classical period ends for me, and the Judaism as exists now begins. From that time on, first of all, Jews are ruled by the rabbis.
Oh, in this time.
In this interview, from, let's say, the 5th century BC until the modern, until after the American and the French Revolution.
All right.
And also, the Jews are never a society, but always a minority.
Always a minority and in diaspora.
And in diaspora. Yeah. And the minority, and this is a very important point, is always at the service of the rulers.
All right, that's interesting.
It is persecuted, but it is not as much persecuted as the peasants. The Jews are not usually, until modern times, at the bottom of the ladder. They are in the upper range. They are very far above the majority of human population, which were serfs and peasants and slaves.
And they were used by the overlords often as bailiffs and as other kinds of
and to
things.
Squeeze the others, exactly.
And they were used in that certain sense because they were seen that where they were able to do that, and that put them, one of the points in your book is, that put the serfs, who they were putting pressure on in the interests of the overlords, who got the gain, but that put them in a very bad light in the terms of the serfs. Whenever they were able to garner power, they would direct it at very often the Jews.
Exactly.
Because they were serving the interests of the
ruling class.
All right, so this is something that I definitely was interested in, and a point that I think is relevant, particularly as we ever want to consider the relationship between Jews and Black folks here. That from the beginning, as he highlights and overly simplifies, obviously over summarizes, Jews have been in my language, upper middle classes, but not quite the ruling elite, because the ruling elite were still the Gentiles, the monarchs, the religious leaders of Christendom, or in some cases Islam. But what he doesn't get into here, but I've been looking into separately, is that one of the, there's this contradiction of folks of the book wanting to respect Jews and even the Hebrew language to a certain extent because of the foundations of the so-called Old Testament, but then also have this hostility against Jews for either the claim that Jews killed Jesus and or because of what is described here, that however the relationship was always of the upper middle class, but in service to those who rule, but this puts them into hostile juxtaposition with those at the bottom. So we see that exact parallel. This is a point I've tried to raise here in the United States, where Jews only come into contact with black folks as that intermediary group in service to the ruling elite, but obviously quite willing to as playing that role, being hostile to those beneath them. So when that's exactly the history he's describing here, that the serfs rise up and they get mad at the Jews first because that's who's been the intermediary in many cases, and certainly in the case of black people here through the various industries where Jews have been encouraged, forced, allowed to thrive: real estate, banking, entertainment. And there's the conflict right there, absent all the other, what I said a moment ago about all the belief systems. So I thought this was a very important point that he's making here.
Exploiters of the rulers, of the kings, of the aristocracy, and so on.
Uh-huh.
Yes, and we have therefore to look on Jewish history not in terms of Gentiles opposing Jews, Christians opposing Jews, Muslim opposing Jews, but in terms of conflicts between classes, nations, groups, in which Jews played different roles, but especially they played the role of servants of the rulers, both among the Muslims and both among the Christians.
And very often not just servants in a servant sense of bringing waiting table, but servants at a high order. Very
high
order
of the
with
high
a considerable
order.
amount of authority over the lower classes, right?
For example,
Yeah.
Jews within a given country had a freedom of movement. They didn't like it in one town, they could live to another. A serf was bound to the soil.
Yes.
A slave was bound to his master. This immediately put them above the majority of the, let's say, the wretched of the earth, to quote Fanon.
Yeah, there's going to be a general thing among Zion.
And of course, we love the quote of Fanon, the reference to Fanon. And that's what he's saying. He's distinguishing as Sartre would in his discussion with Fanon and about, and Fanon himself about the difference between Jews and the colonized African. But this is Shahak making a similar point. All right. So obviously the full video I'm linking in the show description, you can watch on your own. I just wanted to highlight a couple of other points here.
Over that long history up to that period to say, because we made it sound a little bit perhaps idyllic in some people's minds and thoughts of it. There was anti-Semitism.
There was
always some anti-Semitism.
Yes, there is always some xenophobia. Anti-Semitism is a form of xenophobia.
Yeah.
And on this earth, there is always hate of strangers.
Right, by everybody.
By every group,
right.
Greater or weaker. And it is I completely oppose treating anti-Semitism as an isolated phenomenon. Anti-Semitism is a form of xenophobia, and Jewish chauvinism, Jewish hate of strangers, of Gentiles, is another form of xenophobia.
But it was part of the story.
Of course!
So
and now in Israel, it is even more part of the story because Jews are powerful. Jews are now not servants of aristocracy or rulers. Jews are the rulers in Israel and are most powerful state in the Middle East.
Now listen!
Again, that's bars. So I love that point. Anti-Semitism is not special. It's not different. It's a form of xenophobia, and Jews have practiced a form of it against others. And now that they're in the leadership of Israel, the most powerful nation in the so-called Middle East, they're exercising it against everybody else.
That's called my boy! You know nothing about that!
It's not special. And as he pointed out earlier, it is based in many ways the broader context of class, of geopolitical relationships, of, as I pointed out a little bit, religious mythology and so on.
And you said at one point in your book that you said that you do not agree with your Marxist friends who will say that the Nazism or the fascism was in a league with it wasn't the capitalists that were were at many people to try and understand this historical thing. How do you explain the irrationality, the unusualness, the unusual irrationality of what is come to be called the Jewish Holocaust of the 30s in Europe and Eastern Europe and so on? How do you explain it?
I explain it only by feelings of hatred, which can happen and be so strong, not only among Germans, but among many other groups, that they override all consideration of interest. Mm-hmm. Let me give you the first consideration which brought me to this idea. Before Bergen-Belsen, I was in Warsaw Ghetto, almost to the end. Mm. And during the time when...
you would have been little. You would have been a
youngster,
yes,
but I still very much remember.
Right, all right.
During the time that about 500,000 of Warsaw Ghetto Jews were taken to be exterminated by railway, the Nazi army was fighting in Stalingrad against the Russians. Right. And instead of using the railway, of bringing the much needed supplies to their army, they used the railway to exterminate Jews. It's
totally irrational.
Yes.
It doesn't make any sense. I mean, they could have been put in work camps. They would have worked. They would have done
anything. Exactly. They all were working for the German army before. Yes.
Made no sense. Yeah.
After, many years after this, when I have
how can we explain it? Go ahead, sorry.
Well, first of all, there are certain things which cannot be explained, which we can say all explanations are wrong. We don't know.
Yeah, it's irrational.
It's irrational.
Off the charts,
yes.
Yeah.
But many years after this, when I have read a wonderful book by Trevor Roper, The Last Day of Hitler, I found that one of the SS supreme commanders wrote a memorandum saying, why we exterminate the Jews now? Let us win first and exterminate them afterwards.
Right.
But his advice was not taken.
Right.
So I think that's an interesting criticism, and I think that's a lot of the reason why, to his point of referencing Fanon earlier, why those other oppressed communities, particularly those of the colonized world majority, find there to be a lot to appreciate, but there to be shortcomings in the Marxist analysis, that it doesn't account for everything. And in this case, the irrationality of white supremacy. Now, I think there are material explanations for it if we wanted to evolve them, and I'm sure Marxists can come up with them. But I think that this is part of the where there's room, I think, for discussion of the role colonialism plays in shaping culture and consciousness, and of course, Marxists would say the same thing, but that it accounts for some of these unexplained irrationalities, which again, I could probably think of a Marxist, and that the material conditions create what is the phrase I'm wanting to think of, false consciousness among the oppressed that leads them to make certain irrational. But that is a fascinating point, that the Nazis, even against their own fellow advice from their own fellow Nazis, were more interested in exterminating Jews than using the railroads and using Jewish labor to fight the Soviets and maybe even win the war. So in some way, it could be argued that we'd be grateful for their myopia, their genocidal myopia, but I thought a fascinating. So I just wanted to at least acknowledge Shahak's point there as we move ahead a little bit. Charles Murray and the bell curve. That's what he was talking about.
Takes the bell curve and is measuring intelligence. We're discussing it now, and we're now in October 1994, and he's taking a measurement of intelligence, IQ.
I don't believe in IQ.
Well, all right. Let me finish this thought, though, then, Ezra. Then you could go to it. But he's taken the idea of IQ, and he has said that between the various groups of the country, of the world, and on a racial basis and other terms that some people, groups have.
I will give you my
intellectual contributions of the
I will
Jewish
give you
people.
better explanation. 250 years ago, Ashkenazi Jews produced nothing.
All right, yeah.
Why they produced nothing? Because they were under tyranny of the rabbis.
Right. Under the tyranny of the rabbis.
Yes, yes, it is the liberation from the rabbis and from the Jewish orthodoxy, which by a contrast produced this great flourishing, which I don't deny, of Jewish genius. The same thing happened in ancient Greece. When the Greeks liberated themselves from their old customs, look on the 100th century of the classical, of 100 years of classical Athens, what Athens and a small part of Greek were produced. Look what Renaissance, what the Italy Renaissance.
Also, it's very dangerous. This whole business of ethnocentrism and xenophobia, as you say, is very, very dangerous because when you think about it, it was that kind of thing, that kind of argumentation that was going on that 50 years ago that the Jewish people were seen by the Nazis who were in power at that time as Untermenschen.
Exactly.
Right? And it's very, very
It is
dangerous.
wrong, dangerous, and has to be fought against.
Also very, very inappropriate, not only among ourselves as a human society, where we need to have a humanistic association with each other, but one could draw that even larger in terms of, in a certain sense, ecology, or a sense of inclusiveness, that we are inclusive within a system or an orchestra, and everyone must play in the orchestra rather than just a few tubas who can toot and be the leaders or something. Right?
But I will point to another thing.
But we have a
such ideas that you have quoted are also dangerous for Jews and Ashkenazi Jews, because by believing in their superiority, they are losing their mind. And this
and
is
they have, if I'm not wrong, and I don't know, I've not been there much, but there is a problem of the way in which they have dehumanized in the minds of many, some of the Zionists and others in Israel have tended to or maybe I'm wrong, straight me straight if I'm not, have tended to dehumanize the Palestinian peoples, who very often whose land they have taken,
of course,
and the Arabs in general, and perhaps even extending that out to the Muslim or the Islamic world,
well,
right? And that they,
it's
a dangerous thing. Now that they are powerful, there are new responsibilities that should come with that. No?
Of course, they dehumanize the Palestinians most, also because of their military weakness. Because let me tell you that the most important thing which I want to convey is that our attitude on general Israeli Jewish attitude of dehumanization to Palestinians is not so extreme as the average attitude of American Jews.
That's interesting.
I want to point to you that the majority of organized American Jews are supporting the Israeli right wing and the extremists.
All right.
More than they are supporting other people. And I want to tell you that a good proportion of the facts about our oppression and humanization of Palestinians comes from Israeli Jews. And that I have noted, or I want to tell that my position in Israel among my Jews has improved, but of course it has not improved among American Jews or American organized
It's
Jews.
improved from when to when? What made the difference, do you think, in the improvement in the Israeli attitude toward the Arab peoples or the Palestinian
Two things.
peoples?
Modernization, which means, first of all, acceptance of modern fashions, travel abroad, and so on.
By the Sapras?
Yes, by the Sabras also,
right.
but by all the younger generation. And
I think he's
second,
got
I will
this part
surprise you, military defeat.
Military
We were the worst from 67 to 73 when we thought that we are absolutely powerful. It is like in America and Vietnam. It is the military defeat, first in October 73 war, and then in Lebanese, in the war with Lebanon of 3 years, which turned many of us into better sense that they have seen that our army may be powerful, but it has limitations.
So I think he's got that part wrong. But the first part I really liked, that that this idea that one group is more intelligent than another is itself false and based in the conditions and the treatment of those people in any given society. So as he said, two important points. Under Nazi oppression and then under the oppression of the rabbis, Jews were not able to thrive and contribute much to the world. Once Jews freed themselves from Nazis, of course, but then also, but even before that, their own rabbis, they were able to begin to make contributions to society in the sciences, intellectually, so on and so forth. So I think that was deep. The other point being that no group, in this case being, in the context of that horrible book that came out years ago by Charles Murray, The Bell Curve, that was arguing basically inherent in intellectual superiority of white and Asian people and the inferiority of black and brown people. What Shahak is saying is that has nothing to do with it. He's saying that if in other words, if you stop oppressing black people, they will contribute as much as anybody else. Using his own example of the Jews, that nobody is inherently better than any other. It's how are they allowed and able to contribute if they free themselves from their religious binds and limitations, and then free themselves from their colonial relations, then they can contribute as much as anybody else or be put to service of empire as much as anybody else. I just want to wrap here with this point he ends up making about the chauvinism among Jews that creates more oppression for Jews and, by extension, others.
Greatest admirer of the World Bank and of IMF and of Reagan and Nixon, of all prime ministers of Israel.
Well, they're going to get Reagan and Nixon supporters coming stronger in this country.
Yeah, but this is what I am opposing, and I am also pointing to the contradiction in these views. Those in Israel who want to expand and be chauvinistic, they don't want to serve the West. They want to serve the Israel and Israeli Jews. I am pointing to a very important contradiction, that this view will mean that Israeli Jews will have it much worse than during what I call a reasonable peace. Because
if they persist in
this, they will be more, not only they will oppress and kill others, they will be also kill themselves.
And if I may, it may be that we also have a thing to learn in the United States, is that it is not by as much as that might be a tempting nectar to taste, as it were, having been in diaspora for so long, that the ability to have the military power to impose your will upon a people does not necessarily lead to a system that, out of the justice of the system itself or the appropriateness of the system itself, gives you peace. That through an imposed military power, and that for the first time in a couple thousand years they have military power, and that's a heady stuff.
We will never have peace until we will be integrated in a democratic Middle East, and if we will not accept all the peoples of the Middle East as our equal, and if we will not renounce any role imposed by the West, or rather I would say by American establishment, for keeping security or keeping peace for it. And in this, I want to say to you, you mentioned the American money flowing, so much American money flowing to Israel.
$5 billion a year, I think, no?
About
over
like
the
this
long
in
haul.
real
Couldn't
terms,
have existed,
in the last year.
Couldn't have existed without it.
No, it is not true. Israel didn't receive any American money until the War of 73.
Okay.
And Israel existed very well between, let's say, before 67 without American money.
Okay.
The American money was given it, in the word of our satirist, my master feeds me and I bite the people whom he tells me to bite. This is called strategic cooperation. End of quotation. We should renounce this and we will live much better by other people live, by normal trade relations without weapon industry, without...
That's why I always remembered liking Shahak, that he at least would reach that level of a conclusion. I do feel compelled only to say that, again, my point here isn't to try to convince anyone, black people in particular, that there needs to be some kumbaya recognition and understanding or appreciation for Jews or Israel or anything else. My point is just to simply say, as I said in the previous video on this topic, we don't have a proper analysis. We're in general functioning without a proper analysis. And to arrive at one, we do have to have a better understanding of the history, both of Israel, Judaism, European Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, and how all of these communities have fit and continue to fit into this and other societies, the geopolitical and economic relationships that exist, and so on and so forth. So thanks for the suggestion and the reminder to return to Shahak, and I hope that this helps to some extent. We'll continue the conversation, and once again, thanks again to patrons and channel members. And as always, peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. We'll see you next time here at
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.